The Honourable Mark Latham.
Money here. Yeah, thank you, Deputy President. I move that private members' business item number 1614 be considered in the short form, limited over format.
I'll put the question of the Honourable Member. All those in favour say aye. Those against? Carried.
Thank you, and I now formally move 1614 standing in my name. Mr Deputy President, this is a motion that stands up against anti-Semitism, those who would want to destroy the State of Israel, but for our purposes here in the New South Wales Parliament, it also stands up against those who would sabotage New South Wales government funding of an arts festival, an education event, a cultural or sporting event, and this sadly was what happened in the recent Sydney Festival, where there was an allocation of government funding of $5 million, not an insubstantial amount, $5 million, and we know the drain and the pressures on the budget right around the state. Here was $5 million that triggered a boycott and sabotage of the event, whereby 30 acts cancelled, all in the name of something that your average New South Wales taxpayer and citizen would regard as completely inoffensive and trivial. That is the allocation of $20,000 of funding from the Israeli embassy to support a dance choreographer, most likely in his politics of a left-wing variety, who would not have been unsympathetic to the sort of political causes that were advanced in the BDS boycott, perhaps. So why would there be an organised attempt to sabotage a festival for the sake of $20,000 from the Israeli embassy for someone who was a dance choreographer contributing to the festival, and his politics weren't of the conservative kind that you might find in Israel itself? So that in itself just highlights the absurdity of what the BDS campaign was all about. These are people who previously had no objection at all to funding by the Chinese government and their mistreatment of the Uyghur people. That was of no concern to those wanting to boycott and sabotage the Sydney Festival. So the hypocrisy stands out, and we should be clearly saying as a parliament that if you want to go boycott and protest and make your political statements about Israel, go raise your own money. Don't bludge off the New South Wales taxpayer. Don't waste our money as a New South Wales parliament. Don't cause harm to the budget and the taxpayer. Go raise your own money, and quite frankly in our country, it's not a cause I support, but people want to march up and down the street day and night on this particular matter, funded by themselves. That's their right in our free nation, and they can do so. And but the fact is they won't do that because they've got an environment where, in the case of the Sydney Festival, they've ripped it in two, they've launched their sabotage at taxpayers' expense, and they've caused enormous damage. The event has lost a third of its acts, a third of its performances. And it wasn't in great shape anyway because of COVID. The numbers for the Sydney Festival had halved in 2021. And when I asked the question on the notice paper, there was no answer about the attendance in 2022, but it probably was down again. What I did find out, there was $5 million of funding that was actively sabotaged by people supporting the Palestinian cause and supporting the BDS campaign. So surely both sides of politics here in this chamber would recognise it's just completely unacceptable. The taxpayers deserve better. The cause of political neutrality at arts events deserves better. We don't run these events to become political. But unfortunately, so much of artistic endeavour, cultural events so-called, has become just another form of left-wing politics. They should go raise their own money in their own time and do their own protests without bludging on and sabotaging the money provided by the New South Wales government. I mean, people in New South Wales work very, very hard to pay their taxes, and we shouldn't be providing fodder, an environment where those taxes are used to foster and engage in the sort of protests that the Sydney Festival suffered. Now, the festival chair, David Kirk, didn't necessarily bend a knee to BDS, but he apologised on an ABC interview for taking the innocuous $20,000 from the Israeli embassy. Why wouldn't the Israelis be allowed to support one of their performers, a dance choreographer, one of their backstage people participating in this festival? What's wrong with that? Well, you know, we should be encouraging embassies and nations to support the people that they've got at different festivals, to take some of the burden off our taxpayers. It adds to the quality and capacity resources of the event. So why would we ever get into a situation where BDS would ignore, in their anti-Semitism, the situation with the Chinese government funding and the mistreatment of the Uyghurs, but then they pick on $20,000 provided by the Israeli embassy? The average citizen in New South Wales would regard this as abhorrent, and it's time to draw a line in the sand to say this should never happen again. You do one wrecking exercise, it's the last one you ever do.
Deputy President,
I thank all the speakers in the debate, especially the Honourable Scott Farlow and Walt Secord for their rhetorical support, if not necessarily their vote, but their words were very much appreciated indeed. But I understand the reality of politics behind the scenes in a major party. Could I just say, wasn't it refreshing to hear the voice of tolerance and diversity from the Greens and their fellow traveller, Anthony D'Adam? There you had Mr Shoebridge defining a $20,000 donation from the Israeli embassy as a human rights abuse that had to be boycotted. And the tolerance and diversity of saying what we're on about here is smashing the state of Israel, forged out of the horrors of the Holocaust, in support of Hamas-backed boycotts of an artistic event in Sydney. Those members ought to hang their head in shame. It's disgusting to take that point of view about Israel and this particular Sydney festival. It's just completely amazing to otherwise masquerade, to pretend that they're the voice of tolerance and diversity, but none of the tolerance extends to the Jewish people of Israel. None of the diversity extends to the state of Israel. And a $20,000 donation described as measly, that provokes a boycott to sabotage what's supposed to be an artistic event. And as for the minister, he said he supports people being free to express their art. Trying to smash the state of Israel is not art. It's a form of political barbarism, should be rejected in all its forms. The minister said he doesn't support the use of boycotts. Well, why fund them? Why fund them to the tune of $5 million? Now, the minister said, oh, we'd be punishing the Sydney Festival. Well, it's clear what the minister needs to do. He needs to say to the bodies that are so fortunate, that are privileged to receive New South Wales taxpayer funding, people working in factories in St Mary's and Campbelltown who pay their taxes, who won't attend these events necessarily. It's a privilege to receive the money, and what the minister should be saying to the bodies that receive it is you should be able to say that none of your participants, the bookings of the artists that you make, the people you plan to pay, are going to boycott and sabotage this event and wreck our taxpayer funding. That's all the minister needs to say to the Sydney Festival and like bodies. That's the fair and reasonable thing to do. But if you want to turn every single artistic event into a mass political protest designed to smash the state of Israel, designed to denigrate the Jewish people, designed to engage in anti-Semitism, well, the taxpayers will say that's not why we pay our taxes. That's not tolerance and diversity in the state of New South Wales. That's a form of politics that people should fund themselves and go about in their own time in different ways. I don't see why it's impossible for the minister in the future for these type of events just to say you must respect the privilege you have in being taxpayer funded, and you should give us a guarantee there'll be no sabotage.